Hello, Alex. Good to see you.
Hey, Andy, how you doing? Nice to see you as always.
I'm all right. I feel like I've been streaming all day long today. It's been a lot of videos today. How about you?
It's been a long old day of streaming and video calls, Andy. But I'll tell you what, we've had some sessions over the last few weeks, but I'm absolutely pumped for this one. I'm running on adrenaline.
I know, I know. There's a lot of expectation here. Not too much pressure. Hopefully, Robert's not feeling it in the green room. But let's bring him in and say hello. Hey,
hey,
Robert. Shocked to hear. Oh my goodness. All right. Well, I'm going to lower everybody's expectations now. Don't expect it's only 9 o'clock in the morning, and I don't wake up usually till 10. So yeah, but you get what you get. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Robert,
well,
thanks so much for joining us. As you know, I've been a big fan of your work, and this is the first time we've actually spoken, isn't it? After kind of being in digital contact through social media and Twitter for many years. But it's I think it was the start of my PhD 2014. Our head of research now, our previous director, is a digital anthropologist. So when I started thrashing around ideas for my PhD, he said, "Oh, you want to look at netnography?" And I said, "Right, okay, get onto Google." Got the book, and the rest is history. You know, and I followed the different editions. Obviously, the second edition was absolutely like the Bible for my PhD, which was brilliant. And I've managed to publish a few papers. And now the third edition, I lost it for a bit down the back of the settee, but I found it again now, and it's come in really handy for my PhD students. So I know have joined us today. Shouts to Pauline and Maxwell, who found your work really interesting. So it feels like this is a really appropriate time to be connecting with yourself and Salford University. And I know we've got a ton of other researchers from around the UK and beyond as well. There's been a lot of excitement about this one.
I'm delighted. Well, I'm really pleased to be here. I'm so excited to speak to you all. So this is really great. Thank you so much for the invitation, and happy to get things going, and happy to hear from everybody who's listening, and to take some questions and have a real discussion.
Yeah, and if you are joining us for the first time, this is part of a series of events connected to the Disruptive Technologies Cluster at the University of Salford, which I think this must be our 6th event now. We've had so many different topics, haven't we, Alex?
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind ride, but everyone's been really insightful and interested. And you know it's good because you're thinking about it afterwards, and you're talking about it after in talk sessions and things like that as well. So it's all good stuff. It's all recorded, and some of the Q&A and that has been great as well, hasn't it? So yeah, it's been fun. We haven't got one planned in 2 weeks, but we've got something else lined up for next month, haven't we?
We have, yeah. We will announce that at a later date. But for now, I think we should hand over to Robert, who can start us off with a presentation, and then we'll have, as always, enough time for conversation and questions later on.
I feel like I'm breaking up the podcast here. You know, it's like, hey, guys, keep talking.
This is what people are here for, Rob.
I'm in the podcast. Yeah,
it's not the Andy and Alex show. They're here for you.
Or is it Spotify? I don't know which. Yeah.
It's all the platforms. That's what it is.
It's great. So, yeah. It's great. I love the format. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So if it's okay with you guys, I'm going to bump you out and share my screen, and we're going to get going here with the presentation. So
go for it. Over to you.
As a professor, here we go. It's slides, and we figured out the technology. Let's hope it works. You probably see me, and then you should see some slides. Somebody want to just cue me in? Can you see a full screen of slides here that says Netnography for the COVID age? Yes? Are we good? Because I can see, I can only hear.
We're good, Robert. Off you go.
Great, let's go. So as you heard, it's an event of the Disruptive Technologies Cluster. So I'll start out just saying a couple of things about myself. I'm a full-time researcher, and I've been an academic for about 23 years. I've got 6 books and over 100 different publications of different kinds. And my research really focuses on technology, on activism. I started my career studying entertainment, in particular fandom and Star Trek fandom, but it's kind of bridged out to consumer culture in general. Brands are a fascination of mine, as well as marketplaces and social media. And the technique that I'm going to talk to you about, I discovered, or I developed, I should say, kind of as a tool when I was studying Star Trek fans in 1995 when I was a PhD student. So it was pretty much my very first publication was a conference paper and a conference presentation was where I studied X-Files fans and introduced this method of using online research. And I'm gonna back up and talk about that in a moment, give you a little bit more detail. I've worked with a number of different for-profit and nonprofit companies, including a recent global study that I did with a group called Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, which is out of Washington, D.C., which was looking at how multinational tobacco companies are currently using social media to promote their products. That resulted in some petitions and some press attention on what those companies were doing. And my career is really focused, as that kind of brief example shows you, on applying the technique, not just on developing it. So I'm going to talk a lot about theory and about foundations and methodology today. But I would say in my career, theory and application method really were in the service of application, of trying to answer questions and understand what was going on in the world. So I'll try and keep it fairly short. I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to netnography and tell you a little bit about what makes it different. Along the way, and the culmination of that is to give you a current definition of netnography, and it's obviously many things. And then I'm going to talk a bit about why netnography has gained new relevance in our current time, and the title should obviously clue you into what that's going to mean. From there, I'm going to talk a little bit about three new types of netnography and show you as an example some of the ways that netnography has been and is currently being adapted, because my argument here is that netnography is a fluid idea. There's a foundation, and then there are lots of variations as well. And then we will go into Q&A and discussion. So I'm going to start out by talking about qualitative research, because netnography partakes in this field of qualitative research. And qualitative research is not just about using qualitative data, in other words, data that is not numerical. It's also about a particular perspective. And in that perspective, the idea is that although if we're studying consumers, but we could just as easily be talking about citizens, although they seem to be individuals making decisions, in reality, there's a lot of context to our individual decisions. That a lot of what we decide as individuals is really, in many ways, I won't say predetermined, but strongly influenced by our social structures and the cultural norms around us. Those norms not only influence our decisions, but they support them, they modify them, and at times they thwart those decisions, as well as our own individual satisfaction. Although people are searching for happiness, they're searching for personal gratification, the way that they think about what that is very much bound by their socio-cultural and situational circumstances. And so qualitative research is really not just about what decisions they make, but how and why they make them. A lot of the times, if you ask someone why they did something, and this is sort of a frequent PhD level mistake, they want to study the motivation for why people do things. And so they ask them let's say in an interview or on a survey, why did you do that? Or why do you choose a cereal? What do you look for when you choose? And people can't necessarily express those things. They can't necessarily tell you that, it's because I grew up in a particular area where there were these limited choices. For example, my father loves stale bread. He doesn't like fresh bread because he grew up very poor, and all they had to eat was stale bread. And so that reminds him of home. So, it's hard to conceptualize these things. But one of the ways that we get at them is by observing and by looking and by trying to understand the wider scope and the wider circumstance of people's environment. So there are a number of different kinds of qualitative research methods. I don't have the time to go into all of them, but on the bottom left here, you see ethnographic research, and it is a key form. It came from originally from anthropology, but it's certainly associated with sociology and cultural studies and a number of other fields. And in this picture, we have one of the modern founders of ethnography. Actually, ethnography probably goes back over 2,500 years to Herodotus and before, in the Greek historian who traveled with the Greek army and wrote about these foreign cultures. But in our modern age of ethnography, it goes back to this guy who's in white here, Bronislaw Malinowski. And you see this picture of Malinowski, and he's working with some islanders. It looks like he's hollowing out a gourd. And the idea of ethnography is very much that you will observe a culture, but you will also try and participate as much in that culture as you can. And so you see here that Malinowski is kind of sitting on the same log. He doesn't look like these guys. He obviously has a very different haircut. He's wearing shoes. His clothes look very different, but he's trying to participate and to understand what they do, not just by observing them from behind one-way glass, not just by asking them questions, but by doing what they do and talking to them, and not completely fitting in, because you are going to always be as an actual field worker, anthropologist, you're going to be a bit of an outsider. But that outside-inside status, where you try and learn the language, where you try and learn the customs, where you try and do things and participate, is really a key part of it. So ethnography is defined as this cocktail of methodologies where personal engagement is the key to understanding that culture or social setting. And what I showed you there and what I just described is this notion of participant observation. And there are many other methods that we use, like documentary methods, taking photography, and so on. And the goal being description, and description in particular of what this definition by Dick Hobbs says is the intense meaning of social life from the everyday perspective of group members. That it's really that insider perspective that is looked at. So, as technology sort of grew and computer-mediated communications became important in human life, people started to adapt ethnography and think about what participant observation means if you take it to the world of online communications, where people are communicating online. We tend to talk about this as a field or as a site or as a place, but these really are communications, right? They're ways of moving different things around that end up becoming text or audio visual, like this presentation, or audio like a podcast. And so thinking about what is it in common? What do these things have in common that could be ethnographic when we study them? So the general term that I think has become widely accepted for taking ethnography and using it to study computer-mediated communications is online ethnography. And the idea here is that we don't ask people about things, we observe them, that there is a researcher who is immersed in the same process, that it uses multiple methods, and that the goal, again, is this rich or thick description of this intense meaning of social life from the perspective of those who experience it. So this is kind of online ethnography trying to be true to the spirit of ethnography. And there are a number of other methods, a number of different methods that have sort of evolved, that have sort of had their own background and circumstance. Names like virtual ethnography or digital ethnography are what I would consider to be variants of online ethnography. And then there's my variant, which I sort of, as I say, developed in 1995 during my fan studies work, and tried to basically think about systematizing a process that offers a bit of a recipe for social media research. So giving guidelines, giving procedures. So it's defined here in my latest book, the 2020 third edition of my netnography text, which is called The Essential Guide to Qualitative Social Media Research, as a set of general instructions that relate to a specific way to conduct qualitative social media research, using a combination of particular different research practices that are grouped into general categories, right? The general categories of data collection, data analysis, and data interpretation, and these 6 overlapping movements or stages, which I'll talk about in a moment. So in terms of, what is netnography, it has a clear heritage. It builds on work that we can go back in time over 2,000 years to Herodotus's observational work. It clearly has a lineage that goes to anthropology and Malinowski, but it is different. These are different times. And unlike other methods that are out there, like virtual ethnography and digital ethnography, it tends to be more hands-on, how to do, here's what you do step by step, because I think that's how we are in marketing. We're sort of very no-nonsense, rather than in some fields like communications or cultural studies, which tend to spend a lot of time on the philosophical bases, which is fine, and leave a lot to the researcher. For my research, and when I was explaining this, in particular when I was teaching it to other people, I wanted to come up with, and people really responded to, having a workbench level set of steps for how you do this, how you deal with data, how you deal with ethics, and so on. So how do you do these different things? So the idea of what is netnography is basically following these practices so that other people sort of knew what you were doing. And it's around, as I said, this 4-stage, 6-movement process, which looks something like this. So it starts out with a research question. And I won't go into the detail on the individual steps. If there's questions later, I'm happy to answer them. But the research question should be formulated to be within the sweet spot of netnography. So it should be something that you can answer using netnography. Not all questions can be answered. It is not a general all-purpose tool. It's a specific tool for answering certain kinds of things. But questions like how people respond, or what the patterns are in behavior online, or where are the effective influencers or online forces, or what sets of meanings do people have when they discuss particular brands online. All of those are very much in the area of netnography. What people are doing, behind closed doors in their real lives, they may discuss that, but we may not be able to necessarily get access to it in the same way that we could with, say, in-person observation. So then we move into how to collect data. And the idea, moving to the far right bubble here, is that the researcher, just like in ethnography, is immersed in the culture. So it doesn't involve a big download of data all at one time and then sort of coding it, or looking at machine language recognizing of words and building of word clouds. It's a human immersion where you as a researcher or you as a member of a research team are immersed in sites of data where data is emerging and has emerged. And you're reading it and experiencing it in real time and trying to understand it as a human being would understand that. So not as a sort of researcher setting apart from it, but also as someone who is listening to the podcast, watching the videos, reading through the posts, whatever it is, doing it the same way that that an audience member would. You're also investigating. So moving to the far left here, that means downloading data that's already been collected. So you are reading through things and looking for insights and then collecting individual pieces of data that seem interesting. Netnography does not mean casting a drift net and grabbing all the data. It means picking and choosing which pieces of data are important, and I call them deep data in the latest version. Which pieces of data are particularly revelatory, which pieces of data are particularly significant and meaningful, particularly to your question, but also culturally to the people who are doing the interaction. And then finally, the one in the middle is called interaction. And not all netnographies will use interaction, but interaction means that the researcher is now interacting directly in some way with the people who are involved in the online communications. Now that can be interviews, which could be online, they could be in person, they could be over the phone, or it could be setting up something like a research web page. It could be using a mobile phone for a mobile ethnography. It could be having people keep digital diaries, but in some way you're sort of reaching out to people and getting them to gather some extra data for you. Generally that happens after the investigation. So all netnographies will have immersion in them. That's what differentiates them as ethnographic. Pretty much many of them will have investigation, almost all of them, unless they're fully immersive, like something, and I'll talk to you a little bit in a moment about auto-netnographies, which can be fully immersive. And then other ones will build up with some interaction where you couldn't necessarily investigate every element of what you were interested in. You couldn't find people talking about, say, a particular topic, and so you reach out and you interview them, or you set up a research webpage. Then when you've got all your data, your analysis and your interpretation happen, and I call that integration. Both analysis, which is breaking down the data and then finding patterns within it, and interpreting the data, which is looking at the data set as a whole, as a unified whole, and comparing that to other wholes with sort of metaphorical sorts of methods. Both of those things sort of go together. And really this idea of integration and the detailed description of interpretation came because I was quite unsatisfied with the descriptions of what interpretation was and the step-by-step guidance for people as to how to do it. And so I tried to come up with specific steps in this latest third edition about how to do data interpretation and also how to start to combine that with analysis. And then finally, the last stage is just basically presenting your results. You had a research question at the beginning. Your incarnation stage is a presentation of what is the answer. How did you know? What are your findings? What are the implications? And then in a lot of cases in a business context, what are the recommendations that come from that? So you can see that netnography is a very systematic kind of process. as well. Oh, I had some extra steps there. Netnography is ethically bound, so there are specific rules for following your research ethics, for getting your ethical ship in order, knowing exactly what to do under which circumstances. So each of the data collection methods that you see here, investigation, interaction, and immersion, each have different sort of ethical areas that can be tricky to navigate. And so the rules, and I've presented them as a flowchart in the latest book, really help you to navigate the rules that you'll see with human subjects research committees, for example, or with GDPR rules as they currently exist, or with human subject research in the United States, and navigating all that. And then finally, and this is relevant to where the rest of the discussion is going, because netnography was put out there in the 90s and really has evolved with the internet and with internet research in general, as people use netnography and report back on it, they change it, they alter it. So no, I like to say that no two netnographies are ever the same, right? You're always adapting the netnography to the circumstance, and the researcher is adapting it to their own circumstance, to their knowledge, to their field, to their topic of interest. And so netnography is always changing when people write about it, and now we've got something like 10,000 or so different netnographies that are published and accessible. I generally see 2 or 3 or 4 emergent data. That's how Alex and I met. I saw his work. I think he reached out to me, or I reached out to him, and we found each other. And then I've followed along with what he's done, and he's done some really, really interesting things. And his take on netnography is different from mine, and I think that's really a good thing. So netnography has its own history. It's been evolving on its own. It's been evolving based on platforms. So when I started back here, you can see on the bottom left here, I started using netnography when pretty much the only tool people were using at the time was newsgroups. In 1995, the Netscape browser was brand new. It had just been released in 94. And people were using these newsgroups, and I found a ton of data about Star Trek fans and Star Trek culture then. But these social media platforms, as we know them now, they really started to be released and just developed around 2004, 2005, 2006. So you can see this growth. By the time 2008 came and Sage asked me to write my textbook, these things were starting to emerge, and I could start to write about things like Facebook. But there really weren't any netnographies. There hadn't been a lot that was done on it. I'm only one person. As I say, this is crowdsourced also because I can't keep up with things as they're going. And so I wrote as best I could for this new emerging technologies. Once I got asked to write the second edition of the book, it was because what you're seeing here, a lot of these platforms had changed. The affordances people had to converse had changed, and so the research method had to sort of adapt and give more guidance. And so Netnography Redefined really brought in, the example was from Facebook. It actually was about Ebola. One of the key examples I did for data collection and analysis was about Ebola discussions on Netnography. I didn't realize I was being a little prescient to our current times, and then we had the development of all these ones that you kind of see here on the bottom, the more visual ones like Snapchat and Pinterest and Instagram started to really, really blow up. And 2018, I get asked to write another edition. 2020, this netnography book comes out, and I've got examples of many of these different netnographies now that have been published. Tumblr netnographies, Reddit netnographies, Twitter netnographies. I don't believe we've got a TikTok netnography yet, but I certainly have been working with TikTok data recently. But as I say here on the right, we've got Clubhouse now, we've got Discord, we've got podcasts, we've got a lot of stuff that is currently present and that is emerging. And the Netnography Unlimited book, which I'm going to be discussing a bit of the stuff that comes from there in a moment or two, that really starts to look at how different researchers in different fields have used different platforms and have adapted those fundamental basic rules, that core framework of netnography that I showed you a couple of slides ago, how they've adapted that and changed it and developed what goes on inside of things. Like, for example, one of the researchers talks about studying the dark web and talks about how they had to develop out the ethics rules and involve things like encryption technologies and anonymizing their own presence so that some of the illegal stuff didn't catch on to them, and that it didn't make other people really nervous. So long story short, netnography has really been evolving based on these platforms. It's really gone through a radical revolution in the last year and a half or so, as COVID has been, changing everything else as well in our world. And so the events have opened up to, virtual reality, virtual social reality, we might call it. So we have all of these conferences, which used to happen in person, that now happen online and become very amenable to things like netnography. I don't know if any of you have used the online experiences at Airbnb, but I've taken a number of different cooking classes. You can tour zoos. You can get a virtual tour of the Chernobyl plant, where the guy feeds the dogs around Chernobyl while you're live on screen with them. So there's all these online experiences, which now also becomes fodder. And I wrote about one of those in the opening chapter to the Netnography Unlimited book. So this cover to Wired magazine I really like shows how our online reality has become, or had become, I think we're hopefully starting to move away from it a little bit, our daily reality, our social reality. And so we had a number of different netnographies that looked at different aspects of this experience, because people realized, well, I can't do a lot of research in person anymore. I'm going to do it using netnography. And so we had studies on how to treat COVID. We had a recent one, I think this one just came out in the last week or so, about unintended consequences of COVID mitigation matters. And this one also used netnography. We had, at the beginning part, remember this one, we had panic buying and people stocking up on toilet paper and things like that, at least here in the United States, looking at ethnography analysis of consumer sentiment. This was one that recently came out with Teaching and Learning, really about linguistic, about how COVID changed the topics and the practices that people talk about on language students as they have chats online. And this recent one, which I thought was really interesting as well, about when people couldn't travel, how they dreamed about travel and how they expressed those travel dreams using visual imagery on Pinterest. So that's just a short sample, a little bit about how the COVID-19 pandemic has inspired all of this kind of research across a whole bunch of different areas and different fields that have used netnography and have taken advantage of the ability of netnography to give us a peek into this changing social reality. And the final part of the presentation is just to talk about netnography itself as kind of a thought virus, if I might extend that without being alarming. This idea that when people carry netnography within them, that they express it differently in the same way that the coronavirus alters and changes and mutates when it's in different people, and that we see given names. We're on either end here. You guys, the UK variant, the California variant. We're both bookending this set of variants, but the idea being that netnography itself changes every time you use it, that every netnography is different, and that these forms are adaptive to particular cultures, to particular times, to particular platforms, to particular topics, to particular fields, right? To particular theoretical domains even. And so we've got this evolving of netnography, and I'll give you 3 examples that are sort of emerging as dominant variants, right? Important variants within this stream of netnography. And I've identified earlier ones, the book Netnography Redefined that Alex talks about identifies auto-netnography and some other ones. But these other ones I think are new and emerging, and there's constantly other variants that are coming out as well. So let's start off by talking about auto-netnography. And I know I'm starting to bump up against time, and I do want to have time to have discussion and questions. So I may go through a little bit more quickly than usual, but auto-netnography is really about this notion of the focus on yourself, on the person's experience as a human observer of an online experience or of the net. So this little diagram on the right here is sort of showing you, with a bit of a Venn diagram, this overlap between the auto, the ethno, and the net. And this comes from Elizabeth Howard's work. She's probably the person who's developed auto-netnography the most. So, the I, the culture, and the media, looking at that intersection. So, as I said before, the immersive experience is very important to netnography. It really focuses on the immersion in the experience and the telling of the netnography as a bit of a first-person confessional tale. And it's the intent of an auto-netnography is to be able to reveal a human reality and to really sort of be able to create a work that helps people to resonate with other human beings. So rather than looking at content and thinking about content online, it really focuses on the inner experience of the person who is using this communication. Again, very, very much focusing on the culture. So there was an auto-netnography, for example, of what it's like to play Minecraft. The first auto-netnography, what I wrote with my then PhD student Richard Kedzier on Second Life, which, you know, if you're old enough, you might remember there was a lot of research interest in Second Life at one point. And this is Liz Howard, and her work is as a nursing educator. So she teaches other nursing students. She teaches nursing students, I should say, and she wrote about what it's like to teach. And she wrote a lot about online methods of teaching. She works out of the Isle of Man, and she was well ahead of the rest of us before COVID in remote learning and doing distance learning, and then focusing on it as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist, as a cultural observer to analyze that as well. So that's just a very brief taste of what auto-netnography is and what it does. The next one is more than human netnography. And, you know, I was just saying to someone very recently that, you know, we both agreed that all netnographies now are more than human netnographies. And a more than human netnography brings in the difference in the platform. It brings in what may be happening, because a lot of it is guesswork with the algorithms. It brings in the differences between what platforms and which sites, what they offer us, what they allow us to do, their affordances, in other words. And so this netnography sort of seeks to balance the supposed agency of the human actor, the researcher or research team, with what they're working with, the tools, the platforms, the technologies, the software, the programming, its functionality, and so on, in order to, as I say here, highlight the complex and dynamic interactions of people, technology, and socio-material practices. So, you know, it fits in very naturally with views from particular theoretical domains like assemblage theory. And my paper on networks of desire with Tony Patterson and Rachel Ashman is a good example of a more than human netnography about food porn. Actor network theory, post-human perspectives, post-social perspectives, and affordance theory. And the affordance theory perspective, I think you could see in a paper that was just recently published online in the Journal of Consumer Research with myself and two co-authors called How Do Platforms Empower Consumers, where we studied a particular platform and really went deep in the netnography into how the affordances of that platform changed the ability of people to empower themselves as consumers. And so the idea here is to provide sort of a more nuanced, more critical account, and to decenter human agency in some sense and say, you know, we're not entirely in control of our own online experiences. There's a lot that the platform and that the algorithms and the tech companies and so on and other social actors determine for us. So there's another article that I co-wrote with Professor Gretzel called Artificial Intelligence, the Marketer's Dilemma, where we looked at some of these things in the context of marketing. That was just published in the Journal of Marketing earlier this year. And then another research area that I'm looking at is how online dating alters the social experience and how these affordances really marketize what was not as marketized, and certainly not at the same scale, a human experience. And then how do platforms empower consumers? We studied this Brazilian website, Reclame Aqui, which you see on the right-hand side here. And then the last type of netnography that I'll talk about is transformative netnography. And the transformative netnography is really this, it's kind of like action research or transformative consumer research. It's trying to combine a participatory action approach to conducting social research with the social media part of netnography. So it is purpose-driven. The goal is awareness and emancipation, and focusing on the betterment of stakeholders, both individual and social. And so it'll often look at things like the impacts of the commercialization, for example, of social media space and online communications, or of the consequences of inclusion or exclusion. that happen through connected technologies and social media. And so there's been quite a bit of really interesting work in this area, using online platforms to observe and monitor elections. A netnography of what went on in Mozambique was a really interesting one. There's stuff using netnography to understand gangs and gang fighting and gangster life, and how that's really taken on an online element, and what we can do about it and how we can understand it. There are positive approaches, like thinking about peace building communities that are happening in social media, as well as conversion, both to different religions and more radicalized forms of religions, as well as to jihadi groups in particular. And this is just a small sample. There's a lot of work, I think, happening in this field. So these three different areas: auto-netnography, transformative netnography, and more than human netnography. You can certainly read about a bit more about them in the book that just came out earlier this year, Netnography Unlimited. And that's focus of that book was what I was talking about here under the framework of these COVID-like variants. That netnography continues to be shaped and adapted. This is an edited volume. The chapters are by 19 chapters written by 32 different scholars from a lot of different fields, from a lot of different places around the world, also from industry, a number of great researchers working in industry contexts with netnography. And that, take a look back over 2 decades of netnography changing and being altered. This is really the first volume that takes a look at how those practices have been adapted and evolved. And that was, as I say, just published by Routledge Press. So, wrapping up, what just happened was I introduced you to netnography, hopefully brought everybody up to date and up to speed, talked a little bit about its roots and heritage in anthropology and people, great thinkers like Herodotus and Bronislaw Malinowski. Also tried to differentiate it from other methods like virtual and digital ethnography, so you see that there is a clear difference, and that difference really is about the procedures. And then as we take those procedures and think about how they've changed and adapted and use that analog of COVID, we can see that there were a number of different kinds of netnography that are evolving, and many more, 3 new spin-offs that I just described to you. And I hope that I've generated some thought, at least in you guys, that netnography itself as a practice can be a disruptive technology. Let me just stop sharing here. And hopefully we can get into some Q&A or discussion. Yeah.
We sure can. Amazing. Thank you so much. That's been incredible.
Really great, that Robert. Thanks so much. I know I've got several questions here, and I can see there's the audience have posted some really interesting ones as well. So I don't know how you want to start, Andy. Should we start with a bit of audience, or?
I think so. Let's start off with Alexia. I think we've got a really early question. What would you say is a reasonable time frame that ethnographers should invest in order to reach saturation of data? That's a tricky one.
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, every project is different, but in the past. So my first netnography that I wrote for the Journal of Marketing Research was studying online coffee culture on alt.coffee, and for that I dipped into that area, into that website probably 2 or 3 times a week, and I did it for 33 months, which, to be honest, Alexia, was excessive. I mean, that was because I was trying to prove a point, right? That this could be like ethnography. I think it's more about the depth of your immersion than it is about the time frame. So if you if you think you've got enough to write up an interesting article or an interesting thesis or whatever it is, then you probably do. If you can tell that story compellingly and with enough data. I just submitted something about a really interesting current phenomena, and we did a netnography on that one for 6 weeks. The X-Files paper I did over 3 days. I have to admit, the conference paper. So it really does depend. I know in industry they take about 8 to 10 weeks to do one, and I think that's a reasonable time frame for an academic one. If you're writing something up, the one that we published in JCR, it also depends on the outlet too, right? It's so much is contingent. So that one, I think we probably collected data for about 2 or 3 years on that one too, because we wanted to have a wealth of knowledge. But for a lot of topics, I think it's sufficient to probably be doing this for a few months, let's say let's say 3 to 6 months.
Rob, how important is, I know this is an age-old question, but how important is participating in those communities? Can you get richer insights by participating, or is it simply enough to be passionate about the community and absorb yourself?
Yeah, well, Alex, if you've read my stuff, I've moved away from this term participation. I don't really love it. I think it's confusing. It's one of those areas where I think I confused myself and a lot of other people for a number of years, because I was trying too much to fit in-person ethnography into online ethnography. And I think we have to question, what do we mean by participation? And I think I've opted in the book for engagement instead of participation. So what does it mean to engage? So one form of engagement is social engagement, where you're actually talking to people. And I've broken that out, Alex, into interaction, right? That's a separate element that can be or may not be part of your netnography. And in fact, I think you don't necessarily need to have that social interaction for this to be meaningful. You can have an intellectual interaction, engagement. Sorry, you can have an emotional engagement. You can be reading through the material and writing about it and reflecting on it. So the question I like to go back to is, what does a typical participant do? What does a typical person who's using this media do? And then what does it buy you to sort of go in there and stomp around or ask questions? I prefer not to be involved directly in a community. I made that mistake early on. I wrote about it in the first 2 editions of the book. I don't have to go through it now. But I think you lose a lot when you sort of just go, "Hi, I'm a researcher. I'm out here and I want to ask you some questions." I think it's kind of it changes the whole situation. And we know from research that people don't want to be researched online. They don't want to be interrupted when they're doing that. It's sort of like walking into a park and putting a microphone in people's, "Oh, what are you doing now? How does it feel to be at a park?" It's very artificial. So I'd rather just sort of do the deep hanging out that Gertz talks about and do it virtually, but engage in different ways. Think about what it means to be engaged as a human being in this as an experience, rather than to sort of clumsily have to play Q&A with people.
This actually relates to one of the questions we've just got up, because in that process of what we might used to call perhaps lurking and just being present without perhaps intervening, is the question over both obtaining consent and issues of data protection and anonymity. I've certainly felt this a lot with some of the work I've been doing within TikTok, which has been really challenging for a number of reasons, not least of which is that you have many young people that are sharing content, creating content that is in fact in breach of the guidelines of the platform, and then it's difficult to know how to even begin research in that setting. So how do you then approach this in the context of ethnography?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and it's one that I think that the guidelines that I've come up with have been valuable to people since the 90s, and they've been constantly evolving. And I think the starting point is to recognize that these are public sites, right? That people are not unaware that what they're sharing is public. On a site like TikTok, you are there to gather audience, right? It is sort of like studying what you see broadcast on television or what you see written up in a newspaper. It is public data, and people are creating it on their own. That said, you have to follow the general guidelines of, could this harm somebody if I wrote it up in some way? Could it embarrass somebody? Could it cause distress in some way? And what are the positive elements of us understanding this? And weight that. And everything that we know about the consequentialist ethics that go behind research ethics says that, we can shoot radioactive dye into prisoners' arms if there's a chance that this is going to forward science in some way. What we do in ethnography almost all the time is far more innocuous than the medical research that I'm comparing it to. But I think we still need to be careful. And so, I can't go into every element in detail, but in my book, there's an entire thick chapter. And in fact, the entire book, the 3rd edition, is filled with ethical guidelines in every single chapter that walk you through what the potential pitfalls are and how to address them. But the big picture bottom line is, this is public data, okay? Most of it. If you've got to sign in, and you've got to give a password, or you have to get approved by a moderator, it's not public data anymore. It's private data. And there's different rules for that. That requires permission, that requires disclosure. But if it's public data, you can search it on Google and it shows up, it's not behind any kind of firewall, it's not behind any password protection. That is fair game for researchers to study, even though we know people don't want to be studied in that way. So we walk a fine line as researchers. We have to be careful that we're not poisoning the well, but we have a right to advance knowledge in academia. That is what we do. People can't say, no, you can't use my public data while I'm walking down the street and being caught by a CCTV camera. They give up that right. Actually, the law and the way that we run our society says we can use that data for certain things like understanding traffic flows and so on. And the same thing is true of social media data. So, I think we have to approach this carefully as human beings studying other human beings and be very conscious of their humanity and also conscious of how the information might be used potentially to manipulate people. But I certainly feel like if I'm using data that people are sharing online and I'm using it for an emancipatory purpose or an illuminative purpose, that I'm not really, I'm taking cautions to anonymize or pseudonymize them in a way that is respectful. And perhaps if it's really sensitive, to rephrase it so that it can't be backtraced to them. I'm giving you a lot of sort of procedures here in my answer. That I've taken all fair caution and that the positives, hopefully over the long run, will outweigh the risks. I've had okay, I'll go on to other. We have other.
I've got to say the second edition of your book I found really helpful, and the references in there for getting ethical approval for netnography at Salford. But the third edition it's even more kind of clearer about the process and the ethical flowchart that you showed earlier. Yeah. I found hugely now as a PhD supervisor and a journal reviewer and so forth, a really helpful guide to, how to deal with it with the ethics aspects of it as well, and having to kind of approve ethics applications. So that's been really helpful. The most recent edition.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I mean, that was the goal, was to systematize this stuff and publish it so that it clears the way for other people to do it easily, and that it can get through approval easily and help students that way. So I'm glad to hear that it's working out. Great. Digital marketing students. Okay, let me throw that one up again. Okay. Can we say that again?
There we go.
Maxwell. What do you mean by digital marketing students? Okay. Room for a subgroup or genre. I get what you're meaning. Well, good news, Maxwell. I'm working on a book for you guys. So yeah, it'll just be about netnography for business students in general, not just digital marketing, because I think digital marketing interacts a lot with public relations, which is the school I'm in. Public relations interacts a lot with advertising. It interacts a lot with communication management and the comm departments. So all of these guys, I think, deserve a more applied a netnography book, and it's something that I've been writing and working on for a while. But yes, it's not selfish at all. It's not selfish at all. No.
So we've got a couple more questions coming up. So let's try this one out. Do you think some quantitative data can help interpretation?
Yeah, sure. Ask Alex. He's familiar with Netnography Redefined. I wax poetic about the potential for including particularly things like social network analysis. Word clouds have been a part of Netnography for a long time. So word clouds are quantitative way of looking at qualitative data. I think we need to be careful not to lose the forest for the trees, right? As a cultural researcher, you want to be focused on meanings. Things that are linguistic, things that are sort of deep and multi-contextual. We don't want to reduce things down to just a measure of one thing or another, because there are great research methods that do that. But can netnography be helped in total by looking at things like descriptive statistics or explanations of things and then go deeper into it? Absolutely. But it's hard to do multiple things well. And that's one of the reasons why I don't publish big multi-method studies, because when you publish a multi-method study, it goes to the quant people and the qual people, and none of them are happy. so that's the problem. So I think you want to try and focus as much as you can on one area. But it's a great question.
So here's another question about the pandemic and whether you think that it's really changed the way in which people are approaching it, or indeed the prevalence of netnography within the research community.
I mean, the answer there is yes. I mean, I don't know what else to say. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think not only has it affected our cultural awareness of being online more, it has affected the cultural reality of being social online a lot more. There was a year and a half pretty much where I didn't see my family other than online. I bought my 90-year-old dad an Echo Show. So now I talk to him twice a day on, what's online anyways, right? I mean, this is starting to feel more normal than meeting people in person. You get a little nervous about seeing people in the flesh, and you're wearing a mask and you're 6 feet apart. Here I can, I'm toe to toe with you guys. We're closer than we would be if we could get together in person right now. And so the social reality has changed because of our technology. And netnography is a great tool for investigating that, because it allows us a systematic way to make use of the data that's collected while we do that, while we have those we've been having these interactions textually since the 80s, maybe the 70s. Now we're having them in a number of different modalities in ways that can be both recorded and then converted into other forms of text, coded and analyzed and understood and gone back in, go into more, you could take this hour-long thing and do a, you could write it up as an article, or you could analyze it, or you could throw it into a word cloud. There's a lot of things you can do with this now, because our social interaction has generated all of this other data that's bits that's usable in a whole bunch of different ways.
Magda's question here, I think, is brilliant. It's the same question I had, but she's just put it much more articulately than I was going to. But I think it's a great question, and it just put me in mind of a paper I had to review that said it was a netnography, but my understanding of netnography, didn't really seem to be following any of the sort of ethical guidelines or anything else. So I sent it back with major corrections. So is there how do we, Magda's question there is brilliant. How do we decide when netnography stops being netnography, or what is a netnography, or what isn't a netnography?
It's a great, it really is a great question. I think, I think about this quite a bit, actually. And I think there are certain, that's why I threw up those, that chart. There are certain core elements that distinguish a netnography from being a netnography. One of them being that you cite other netnographic work, right? That you work within how do we know that anthropology is anthropology or marketing is marketing, right? I see work published in comm all the time that could be published in marketing, but they cite comm researchers, use comm theories, and come up with comm types of conclusions. So if we think about netnography as a sort of a subfield of researchers who are aware of each other's work because they're using sort of a common set of tools and techniques and language. It's linguistic, Magda. I mean, it's a language, right? And then I think if you do, as Alex was saying, if you call it a netnography, but you ignore the ethical rules, it's not a netnography. And I think what happened was your bullshit detector went up, right? The hair went up on the back of your neck, and you went, you can't do that and call it a netnography, because it isn't one, right? Yeah. I have strong feelings about past works that have talked about, netnography is just content analysis. You can do whatever you want. There's no ethical rules. A highly cited work I won't mention says this. That work was clearly not a netnography. So there's people who sort of ride on netnography coattails without necessarily doing netnography. If you follow the guidance around data collection, around analysis, around ethics, and around communication that have been set out really clearly now in 3 different books, that all build on each other, that's a netnography. If you don't, it isn't. It doesn't matter what you say. So I think those fundamental principles are there. But the question you ask is a good one, which is, at what point does a coronavirus variant evolve to the point where it's not coronavirus anymore? And the answer is, well, we'll probably find out, and it won't be coronavirus. It'll move in, it'll be a different species of virus at that point, right? But right now we're looking at variants, and that's what we're talking about here. That's why I think the metaphor works for that. We're talking about variants of netnography, not a new thing. Once it becomes a new thing, it's something different. Well,
so we are running out of time. Let's go with this one.
Yes. The answer to you, Leah, is absolutely. And I've got a paper actually that I'm working on for resubmission now, which is directly about cyberbullying in a particular marketing-oriented domain. It's a huge issue. I mean, aggression is something that is not new in this space. I noticed it and I wrote about it In the earliest work that I did, you can go back into the earliest work in the 1980s, and people are talking about trolling, and they're talking about flame wars. This aggression online is not new. It's part of the way that human beings are interacting with each other through technology, and has been from the beginning. There probably were cavemen who typed, "Screw you, damn other member of tribe," onto the wall 100,000 years ago, right? I mean, this is just how we communicate with each other. Aggression's part of our nature. And so we shouldn't be surprised. And, I think eliminating it would be nice, but I don't think that's a realistic goal. I think we have to learn how to deal with it, how to handle this.
Yeah, fantastic.
Brilliant.
Good.
So I think we are out of time. Well, we're over time.
Great. Let me say, great set of questions.
They really are. They're a lot
fun.
And Rob, fun. I guess I think we've covered most things, but yours very, very general. If somebody sends you a tweet or a message,
always.
So
always. You know me, Alex. I answer my tweets. Sometimes it takes me a few days,
yeah.
But I'm out there. I'm easy to reach.
Absolutely, and you've always been, if I've had the odd question or sort of comment or whatever, you've been so generous with your time, and thanks so much again for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Alex. It's really
great to have you here, and thanks everyone for joining us. And stay tuned for our next events. Good to see you all.
Everybody.
Disruptive technologies rule. There you go.
So do. Have a good rest of your day, Rob.
Thanks, you guys too.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.